Socialism, for many today, especially among younger Eastern Europeans, is a word loaded with negativity. It's often associated with repression, deportations, and hardship. In Lithuania, this sentiment is common. Ask someone under 30, and you'll likely hear stories of suffering, of lost freedom, and of Soviet occupation. But ask someone who actually lived through the 1970s, someone who experienced life in the Lithuanian SSR, and you might hear something very different. Memories of security, education, full employment, and a sense of purpose. One chapter in this story, however, is consistently ignored, or just deliberately distorted, that of Lithuania's turn to socialism in 1940. Most online sources and mainstream accounts paint it as a violent Soviet invasion, a nation dragged kicking and screaming into communism. But that narrative falls apart the moment you examine the actual historical record. But first, if we are to understand how and why Lithuania became a Soviet socialist republic, we must go back, not just to 1940, but to the decades that led up to it. The collapse of the Russian Empire, the bourgeois republic of the interwar years, and the deep class contradictions that shaped the country's fate. This is the real story of Lithuania's socialist revolution. Up until the Russian Revolution of 1917, none of the three Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had ever known modern state independence. Since the Middle Ages, they had always lived under foreign rule. It would therefore be likely to expect that the fight for independence and for separation from Russia would have been the dominating factor in the political life of all three countries. Many writers about the Baltics have assumed that this was so, and have pictured the Baltic struggle for independence as being on the same footing as the Polish struggle against Russian rule, or the struggle of the Czechs and Croats against Austria-Hungary. However, it's not as simple as that. During the Middle Ages, the northern part of the Baltic countries, that is Estonia and most of Latvia, fell under German rule, while the southern part, Lithuania, and the Latgale province of Latvia fell to the Poles. German and Polish nobles partitioned the Baltic lands between them and established themselves as feudal landlords ruling the native peasantry. In the 18th century, the Russian Tsars annexed all these territories, but they did not get rid of the German Balt or Polish landlords. They instead retained them in their position of power in these lands and used them to keep down the native peasants. The 19th century saw an important distinction between the position of peasants in the north, under the German Balts, and those in the south, under the Poles. In the northern territories, the abolition of serfdom in 1861 transformed the peasants into landless agricultural laborers working on the big German Balt estates. But in the south, there was constant friction between the Russian and the Polish landlords, and consequently, the former arranged the liberation of the peasant serfs in 1851 to weaken the power of the Poles. Instead of simply transforming them all into landless laborers on the Polish estates, they left some of them with small land holdings of their own. This did not mean the elimination of the Polish landlords, but it certainly left them weaker than their German Balt counterpart. This complex nature of social classes in the Baltics had important political consequences. The main effect was that the nationalist struggle for state independence and separation from Russia never became a predominant factor in local politics. On one hand, the small native middle class was too weak politically and economically to lead such a national campaign for independence. It limited itself to moderate requests for a measure of local administrative autonomy and linguistic freedom under Russian rule. On the other hand, the native working class and peasants, who were not totally indifferent to national problems, were mainly concerned with defending their standards of living against their German Balt and Polish landlords and regarded this antagonism of classes as outweighing the national struggle against Russia. The working class and peasants certainly opposed the rule of the Tsar, the Russian troops and officials, but they regarded them mainly as the backers and protectors of their German Balt and Polish masters. The main effect of all this was that nowhere was there to be found among the Baltic peoples that widespread antipathy to everything Russian, including Russian culture and learning, which had developed in Russian Poland because of quite different social and historical conditions. This anomaly of the Baltic liberation movement was shown quite clearly during the uprising of 1905.
В стране нарастала социальная напряженность. В июле 1904 года эсеровским террористом Сазоновым был убит сторонник маленькой победоносной войны Плеве. Священник Георгий Гапон организовал 9 января 1905 года шествие петербургских рабочих к Зимнему дворцу с тем, чтобы вручить царю петицию. Демонстрация была расстреляна.
In the Baltic social democratic parties, the Bolshevik wings had strong support and, in fact, comprised almost the whole of the Latvian party. It is not surprising that, when events in Moscow and St. Petersburg sparked a simultaneous uprising throughout Russia in the autumn of 1905, the working-class organizations of Tallinn, Riga, and Kaunas were among the most active participants. Barricades were raised in both cities, and the Bolsheviks held Tallinn, the Estonian capital, for several days. Simultaneously, political general strikes were declared in cities around Estonia, as well as the Farr revolt, which spread throughout the whole countryside. The agricultural laborers showed surprising revolutionary enthusiasm and organized armed attacks on the manners of their German Balt masters. In Latvia, the support for the Bolsheviks was widespread enough to enable an American historian to state that, quote, the Lettish population sided with the Social Democrats almost to a man, end quote. Remember, the Latvian Social Democratic Party was made up mainly of Latvian Bolsheviks. You would have been safe to think that the revolutionary movement in Lithuania would have been less developed. Firstly because, as already explained, there was a substantial number of small native well-to-do farmers there, in contrast to Estonia and Latvia, and secondly because the Roman Catholic clergy exercised a strong moderating influence on the peasants. But here also, revolt was widespread. The Social Democratic Party of Lithuania had been founded as early as 1894 and had already organized numerous strikes in Vilnius and Kaunas. One of the founders of the Lithuanian organization was Felix Dzerzhinsky, who would later go on to become one of Lenin's closest collaborators. When the 1905 uprising broke out, revolutionary activity was hardly less widespread in Lithuania than in Estonia and Latvia. General strikes were declared in Vilnius and Kaunas, and the Bolsheviks even succeeded in organizing a general strike of agricultural laborers. The surprising scope of these Baltic uprisings can be seen by the extent of the repression that followed them. Even as late as 1907, after the immediate events of the uprising had died down in Russia itself, the Tsar was still finding it necessary to maintain penal detachments in the Baltic. The punishment of the rebelling Baltic workers and peasants was just as severe as the Russians, but it failed in crushing them. When the Russian working class organizations renewed their activities again in 1912-13, the Baltic movement quickly began to revive with it. This was well shown in 1912 when the shooting of several hundred workers at the Lena goldfields in far-off Siberia led to mass political strikes in all the big Baltic towns. This was a remarkable instance of coordination between the Baltic and Russian labor movements. With context, all these facts seem to prove that it was a working-class movement for social liberation rather than any nationalist or separatist campaign that held the field of Baltic politics in the years immediately preceding the Russian Revolution, and that this movement, which would seem to have represented the majority of the population in Estonia and Latvia, and a large part of it in Lithuania, so far from seeing its fight as directed against Russia, regarded it as part of a common fight of all the peoples of the Russian Empire, that being Russians, Ukrainians, Finns, Georgians, etc., against their masters, whether Russians, Germans, Balts, or Poles. On the other hand, the small section of rich natives, so far from leading a struggle for independence from Russia, were so opposed to the revolutionary tendencies of their fellow countrymen that they sided with the Russian rulers and their German Balt and Polish supporters.
The devastation was something I never could have imagined. The whole place gave one a most eerie sensation.
There was stunted trees, torn to shreds with shell fire, and there was shell holes all over the place.
We were relieving men of the 28th Division, and as they passed us, we would say, "What's it like up there?" The reply invariably came back, "Bloody awful, mate."
The old sweats coming back, got their tails up all right, but I didn't know what to expect, just hadn't a clue.
It was deadly warfare. You were facing the Germans.
The Germans occupied Lithuania as early as 1915. Their ensuing policy towards the country passed through two distinct phases. At first, they patronized the Polish landowners and offered to include Lithuania in a Polish vassal state. They even brought in Polish troops from Western Poland to help in the administration. During this period of German rule, Lithuanian peasants were jointly governed by Germans and Poles, and any expression of Lithuanian nationalism was strictly prohibited. After the fall of the Russian Tsardom in March of 1917, there was a change. The new Russian regime under the provisional government reversed the Tsarist attitude towards the Poles. It proclaimed support for Polish independence and permitted the formation of Polish units in the Russian armies. This naturally influenced the attitude of some of the Polish leaders and made them noticeably less anti-Russian and less pro-German. This, as you'd expect, affected German policy, which quickly became less friendly to the Poles and less hostile to the Lithuanians. The previous repression of Lithuanian nationalism ceased, and the Germans even succeeded in recruiting a group of middle-class Lithuanian nationalist politicians to form a national council. From the autumn of 1917 until the end of German rule in Lithuania, there was close collaboration between the German authorities and the National Council headed by Antanas Smetona. In opposition to the Smetona Group and the Germans stood the Bolshevik Lithuanian Social Democratic Party, whose surprisingly strong support among both the town workers and the peasants had already been shown in the 1905 uprising. The exiled leader of this party, Kapsukas, returned from America to Russia in 1917, and from there traveled illegally to Lithuania in 1918 to stir up the population against the Smetona government and the German forces of occupation. The main center of the Bolsheviks was in the capital of Vilnius, where they had support not only among the Lithuanians, but also among the Poles and Jews, who formed most of the city's working-class population. As soon as the armistice was signed, the demoralized German troops started to withdraw, and the Smetona National Council withdrew with them. At the same time, Kapsukas, the Bolshevik leader, proclaimed a Soviet-Lithuanian Republic and set up a government in Vilnius with the assistance of units of the Red Army, which occupied the city on January 5, 1919. As in the case of Estonia and Latvia, the establishment of the Red Vilnius government is often described as if it had been the result of an invasion by Red Russian troops. As also in the other two countries, there were few Russians in these units. The units that occupied Vilnius consisted almost entirely of Lithuanians and Poles, who had fled to Russia when the Germans had originally occupied this area. The importance of the Polish element in these units is indicated by the fact that on December 30th, 1918, the Polish foreign minister sent a protest to Moscow complaining that Red Polish troops were marching on Vilnius. Furthermore, the Red government set up by Kapsukas in Vilnius contained no Russians, but consisted of Lithuanians, Poles, and Jews. Indeed, on March 4th, the leader of the anti-Bolshevik Polish Socialist Party protested that the Vilnius Red government contained so many Poles that it must be intended as a propaganda move to impress the Polish working class. This Red government could not extend its rule over very much of the country, for the whole of the western areas remained in the hands of the German occupying forces and the National Council of Smetona. Nor were they able to retain power even in Vilnius for very long, for they were soon attacked by Polish troops sent from Warsaw under the command of Pilsudski. These Polish troops advanced rapidly and captured Vilnius on April 19, 1919. They immediately arrested over 2,000 Vilnius Reds and suppressed the Red Lithuanian government. During the Polish attack, the Reds obtained no assistance from Smetona's National Council, for the latter was well content to see its internal enemies suppressed, even though this might mean the annexation of the historic Lithuanian capital by the Poles. Once the Red Center had been occupied, all the Bolshevik leaders were either in prison, exile, or hidden underground. The Smetona government was able to strengthen its position in what was left of Lithuania, especially as they continued to be backed up by the Germans' troops, which remained in the western part of the country till the end of 1919. Despite the presence of German troops, the Smetona government was not entirely secure, and as late as October 1919, it had to appeal to the Germans for war material to suppress the Bolsheviks, who were still very active. After the Germans finally withdrew, the Smetona government continued to rule in Kaunas, but Smetona had made himself so universally unpopular by his pro-German policy that he had to be dropped from the government shortly afterwards. In Vilnius, the Bolsheviks were undoubtedly in a majority alongside Kaunas, but it is difficult to estimate the attitude of the peasants in the country districts, for these were mainly under the rule of the German Army of Occupation and the Smetona National Council throughout almost the whole of this period. It seems probable that in the period immediately after the armistice, these peasants were strongly pro-Bolshevik. This would make sense because of the experience of the revolt in 1905, which showed that large sections of the peasants favored the Bolsheviks. And there is further evidence that, when the Germans started withdrawing in 1918, Smetona did not even bother to try and rally support, but hastily withdrew with them. There is one other thing about the Lithuanian situation which differentiates it from the position in Estonia and Latvia. That is, the widespread sympathy for Soviet Russia that was set off by the subsequent developments of the Vilnius dispute. When the Red Army started pushing back the Polish armies in the Russo-Polish War of 1920, the Smetona government in Lithuania thought it advisable to reassure its position against possible difficulties by signing an agreement with Soviet Russia. The result was a treaty signed in July 1920, by which Russia was the first power to give recognition to Lithuanian independence. In the treaty, Russia recognized Lithuania's right to Vilnius, even though it was at that time still occupied by the Poles. Very shortly after the signature of the treaty, the Red Army pushed the Poles westwards, and in the process occupied Vilnius. To everyone's surprise, they immediately handed it over to the Lithuanians. This unexpected action had, as it was no doubt intended to have, a profound effect on all Lithuanians, including those who had previously been most hostile to Soviet Russia, and earned for Russia a gratitude that was not weakened when, as a result of a surprise coup in October 1920, Poland once more occupied the city by armed force and annexed it to the Polish state. The Allies were in no hurry to recognize independence. Recognition was delayed as long as it appeared possible that the whole country might be absorbed by Poland, and was only finally given in 1922, 2 years after it had been granted by Soviet Russia. There are a few possible conclusions we can get from this. Firstly, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it is certain that most of the native population supported the Bolshevik program in 1917 to 18 and 21 and wished their countries to form a Soviet republic linked with Soviet Russia, Soviet Ukraine, etc. In all three countries, the local population established Soviet governments as soon as the occupation forces withdrew. Had it not been for foreign intervention, all three states would have become Soviet republics and constituent parts of the USSR. Secondly, these governments were established with practically no military assistance or intervention from Soviet Russian forces. Russian forces were too busy fighting in other parts of the old Russian Empire to be able to give much help to the Baltic communists. Organized Red Army units fought in all three Baltic states, but these were composed almost exclusively of nationals of the countries and not of Russians. Thirdly, the small native bourgeois and merchant elements in the three Baltic countries, who finally established the independent governments in 1920, and who controlled the subsequent histories of the three states, played no independent part in the actual formation of these states, and were only able to gain control of them as a result of the military defeat of their opponents by British, German, Polish, Finnish, White Russian, and German Balt armed forces. Following the events of World War I, the Baltic governments were quick to outlaw communism, to make sure the workers and peasants didn't attempt another uprising. Unfortunately for them, it did not work in the long run.
Летом лучше, чем зимой. С войной покончили мы счеты, с войной покончили мы счеты, с войной покончили мы счеты. Бери шинель, пошли домой. Война нас гнула и косила, пришел конец ей самой. 4 года мать без сына, 4 года мать без сына, 4 года мать без сына. Бери шинель, пошли домой. К зале и пеплу наших улиц опять, товарищ мой.
The idea that Lithuania, and therefore Latvia and Estonia, were independent during the interwar period is a big misjudgment of Baltic history. All three states were in a depressed condition throughout most of this period. The Baltic industry, which includes its ports, communications, and industries, depended on the industrial and commercial development of Russia. When this was cut off by independence and cut off by the anti-Soviet policy of the three governments, the previously flourishing commercial centers such as Riga and Vilnius withered and decayed. Vilnius was isolated in a dead end after its seizure by Poland, disappeared as a commercial and railway center, and instead became the most poverty-stricken and miserable city in all of Poland. Over the border in Lithuania, the capital of Kaunas was not in much better position, and by 1940, 30,000 of its 150,000 inhabitants were unemployed. most of its industry owned by foreign monopolies and capitalists. All this might have been easier to bear if it had been compensated by a flourishing agricultural development, but this possibility was eliminated by the scarcity of land reforms that followed the upheavals of 1917 to 20. The revolutionary fever among the peasants and the example of Russia across the border made it essential for the three governments to introduce some sort of agrarian reforms, but in all cases, the measures that were carried through fell short of what was necessary either to satisfy the peasants or to ensure economic stability. The most visible result of the reforms was that the old German Balt landlords and kulaks were forced to share some of their land and privileges with a new class of native large farmers, though they still retained a substantial stake in the country. Apart from the serious economic effects for the bourgeoisie, this lack of Baltic land reforms led to a continuance of the old social conflicts and inequalities that had plagued the three countries before their independence. Another serious effect of these economic conditions was the extent to which all three states were vulnerable to economic pressure from foreign trading interests. The effect of some of this trade on living standards inside the countries can be guessed from the fact that in Latvia in the 1930s, the local population had to pay 3 times as much for its butter as was charged to the exporting interests. It is hardly up for debate that these economic difficulties would not have occurred had the Baltic states remained attached to the USSR. The economic and agricultural development of the Soviets had been remarkably spread over the different territories that make up the Union and had embraced both the old established centers, such as the Moscow region and Donbas, and new areas such as the Urals and Siberia. Inevitably, these economic difficulties gave rise to political and social difficulties. Throughout the greater part of the 20 years' independence, all three states were subject to a succession of political upheavals. These upheavals were particularly significant when it is remembered that the establishment of the Pats, Ulmanis, and Smetona regimes had originally entailed the physical extermination of practically all the opposition leaders of 1917 to 20, and the illegalization of all the left-wing political parties and trade unions. Though all three governments established parliamentary systems in 1920, each contained certain decisive limitations of democratic rights, so that the authors of the Royal Institute of International Affairs booklet on the Baltic states felt obliged to write in 1938 that, quote, "It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that democratic institutions, as operated during a period of parliamentary government lasting from 1922 to 1926 in Lithuania, and from 1920 to 1934 in Latvia and Estonia, never functioned properly from the time of their inception until their abrogation."
Буржуазная Литва не могла обеспечить работу трудовым рукам. В Каунасе был последний предел нищеты, квартал, прозванный Бразилка. Доведенные до отчаяния люди отсюда уходили по свету искать кусок хлеба. Более 100 тысяч литовцев вынуждены были покинуть родину, изгнанные бичом голода, разорения, безработицы.
Despite these limitations on democracy, and despite the loss of almost all their experienced leaders, the working class organizations made a quick recovery after 1920 in all three states. In Estonia, the government felt obliged to take drastic measures against them as early as 1922. In that year, the communist leader Kingissepp, who had returned from exile in Russia, was arrested and immediately shot without trial. In Lithuania, politics were even more unstable than in Estonia and Latvia. Despite the repression of all the left-wing parties and organizations in 1917 to 20, a revolutionary workers' group headed the polls in all the main towns during elections in 1922. But within a few months, all its deputies had been arrested and imprisoned. Similarly, in 1926, when a left-wing government came to power, it was soon overthrown by an army coup, which arrested the members of the cabinet and forced the president to accept a government led by Smetona, whose unpopularity had kept him out of public life since 1920. Immediately after this coup d'etat, Smetona's police arrested and executed 4 communist leaders, and within less than a year, 800 workers had been imprisoned for quote-unquote communist activities. 2 years later, Smetona amended the constitution to give the president almost dictatorial powers. The cumulative effect of these measures justified a British observer in writing in 1940 that, quote, "The country had existed only 20 years, but it had already the air of the old regime," end quote. By these various repressive measures, Smetona succeeded in keeping the opposition within bounds. But during the 5 years immediately preceding the 1940 Bolshevik Revolution, there were many signs that the revolutionary temper of the town workers and the agricultural laborers was rising once more. In 1935 and again in 1936, peasant revolts against the government broke out in the Suwalki district, and in June 1936, a general strike was declared by the labor movement of Kaunas, the capital at the time. Before the 1936 strike could be mastered, the government had to declare a state of emergency and use troops. Given this, it must be admitted that none of the 3 Baltic states was a genuine democracy at any time during their 20 years' independence. During the first decade of independence, they were only able to retain democratic forms by adding special clauses in their constitutions involving serious infringements on full democratic liberty. While during the second decade, Lithuania moved more towards totalitarian forms, while both Estonia and Latvia introduced open fascist regimes. Throughout the whole period in all 3 states, the communist movement was subject to extreme repressive measures. Anybody attempting to spread communist views or taking up working-class issues in an aggressive spirit was in danger of immediate suppression, imprisonment, and possibly death. Because of the strength of the communist movement from 1917 to 1920, this repression was equivalent to the permanent fear of a large part of the population. It can be said that only by such repression and fear was it possible for the 3 governing regimes to maintain their rule throughout the 20 years of independence. Before moving into the events of the 1940 revolution, it is necessary to understand the man who shaped Lithuania's authoritarian trajectory in the interwar period. Antanas Smetona, a figure whose legacy is inseparable from reaction, repression, and betrayal of the working masses.
Iš karo muziejaus nesuskaitomų žmonių minios nuvyko prezidentūron pasveikinti tautos vadą Antaną Smetoną ir išklausyti šio istorinių momentų jo tartą žodį. Lietuvos padėkos Šiaulių sąjungos vadui, Šiaulių sąjungos studentams, moksleiviams ir visiems, kurie tenai yra atvykę. Reiškiu gilios padėkos progą istoringą Lietuvai. Ta proga.
As we already discussed, Smetona first rose to prominence during World War I, emerging from the Lithuanian nationalists with close ideological and material ties to the German imperialists. Far from being a hero of independence, he was a calculating opportunist who saw in German militarism as a tool for his personal and class ambitions. Even in his early years, Smetona aligned himself with conservative landlord circles and the Catholic bourgeoisie, laying the groundwork for a Lithuania dominated not by the will of the people, but by the interests of a privileged elite. Smetona was born on the 10th of August, 1874, in the village of Uzhulenis in the Russian Empire, to a family of farmers. During his early life, he studied at the University of St. Petersburg. Back in Lithuania, and between school, he would work as a journalist. After he graduated from university in 1902, he moved to Vilnius and worked at the Vilnius Land Bank until 1915. In 1904, he joined a Lithuanian right-wing nationalist party by the name of the Lithuanian Democratic Party. He was later elected to its presidency. In 1904 and 1907, he was on the staff of the biggest Lithuanian newspaper, VILNIUS News. Until his coup of 1926, he devoted substantial amounts of time and effort to the Lithuanian press. 2 years after coming back to Lithuania, he married Sofia Chodakauskaitė in the Church of St. Raphael the Archangel in Vilnius. After Lithuania declared independence in 1918, Smetona briefly served as head of state. But his open sympathies for the German occupation forces and his elitist contempt for democratic governance soon led to his marginalization. By the early 1920s, the Lithuanian Seimas had turned its back on him. In the eyes of many, Smetona had become politically irrelevant. But that changed in 1926, when the tide of popular support for socialism and working-class representation surged in Lithuania. A left-leaning government, with broad backing from workers and peasants, came to power promising social reforms and democratic renewal. This posed a direct threat to the capitalist landlords, the military brass, and the reactionary clergy, forces that had long feared the revolutionary potential of the Lithuanian masses. With their backing, and under the shadow of international fascism rising in Europe, Smetona staged a right-wing coup d'etat. Soldiers stormed parliament. The legitimate government was overthrown, and the country was handed over to a regime that would be compared to those of Mussolini and Hitler, but of course, on a much smaller scale. Under Smetona's rule, political repression intensified immediately. Trade unions were crushed, and mass arrests and executions of working-class leaders followed. His Lithuanian Nationalist Union, a party steeped in fascist aesthetics, including the use of the swastika on its badge, became the sole political force in the country, ruling with an iron fist. Smetona's regime, far from defending Lithuanian independence, bent ever closer to the will of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Criticism of Hitler or Mussolini became a crime. The Lithuanian press, once a modest space for democratic debate, which Smetona not only supported himself in his youth, but was a big contributor to, was censored into submission. By the end of the 1930s, the regime resembled the very old regimes the people had revolted against in 1917. Smetona's Lithuania was not a democracy. It was a prison state for workers, peasants, and progressive intellectuals. And just like in Latvia and Estonia, the so-called independence of the interwar years rested not on popular will, but on the brutal suppression of it. It is no wonder, then, that when the Red Army entered Lithuania in 1940 and a new revolutionary government was formed, it found thousands of workers, students, and leftists rotting in Smetona's jails. Smetona ruled not with the people, but against them. And history would soon make clear that the Lithuanian people, despite 2 decades of repression, had not forgotten the dream of 1917.
Глеб Жиглов и Володя Шарапов за столом засиделись не зря. Глеб Жиглов и Володя Шарапов ловят банду и главаря.
Today, most mainstream accounts portray 1940 as the year Lithuania was helplessly invaded by a foreign empire, an innocent nation swallowed by Soviet aggression. You'll find endless blog posts, reactionary articles, and historical YouTube videos repeating this story as fact. They speak of mass deportations, forced annexation, and genocide, but never mention the political reality of pre-war Lithuania, or the working class revolution that took place that summer. And if you try to find a positive or even balanced view, you'll have to dig deep, far beyond the surface of the post-1990 revisionist flood. Much of what's commonly cited today only began appearing after 1990, once bourgeois nationalism had returned, and the old ruling class narratives were dusted off and repackaged. Contemporary sources from the time, including books, newspapers, and first-hand accounts, paint a very different picture. One of mass mobilization, political transformation, and widespread popular support for socialism. The idea that Lithuania was invaded and forced into the Soviet Union is a myth, a convenient one, crafted by Western-aligned historians and nationalist politicians to erase the real, material history of class struggle in the Baltics. As we've already discussed, interwar Lithuania was not a free democracy. It was a dictatorship, dominated by landlords, industrialists, and a narrow elite. To understand why this happened and how the events of 1940 unfolded, we need to again examine the broader context, the outbreak of World War II, the shifting alliances of the great powers, and the revolutionary wave that followed.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
On March 18, 1938, the top-secret Directive number 472/38 was issued to the German armed forces, instructing them to invade the western part of Lithuania, specifically the Klaipėda territory, also known as Memel in German. The land forces of the Reich, supported by the aviation and the fleet, without any additional mobilization, had to rapidly occupy the Klaipėda territory and other points in western Lithuania. To carry out the order, the German troops stationed in East Prussia were put on the alert. Under the pretext of military exercises, the SS and SA shock mechanized units were moved to the Lithuanian border. German military aircraft made flights over the Klaipėda territory and other places of Lithuania. The order of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, issued on July 7, 1938, stated again that Germany did not give up its intentions to occupy the Klaipėda territory. On October 1, 1938, Hitler invaded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Germany then put pressure on Lithuania to surrender the Klaipėda territory. Reports of Germany's intention to occupy the Klaipėda territory were received in Kaunas from various sources. The matter was dealt with in the messages sent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs by the Lithuanian ministers in Germany and France and other countries. The Lithuanian military attaché in Berlin arrived in Kaunas and personally informed President Smetona and some other government members of Germany's intentions to invade the Klaipėda territory. On October 21, 1938, Hitler and Keitel signed Directive number 236/38 on the occupation of the whole of Czechoslovakia and the Klaipėda region. Section 3 of the directive the occupation of the Klaipėda region stated that the political situation might set the German armed forces the task of occupying the Klaipėda region. In this connection, they were to be guided by the 1938 Directive number 472/38 and to act in a way ensuring the performance of the operation in the shortest time possible. The USSR exposed Nazi Germany's plans to occupy the Klaipėda territory and denounced the policy of the aggressors. Pravda, the central newspaper of the Soviet Union, wrote that German fascism was determined to choose Lithuania as its next victim, that neither the aggressors nor their accomplices could ever conceal the tragic consequences that would happen to small nations as a result of the policy pursued by the Munich plotters, German fascist collaborators. On March 15, 1939, Nazi Germany, with the complicity of Britain and France, occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. On March 19th, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs Ribbentrop summoned the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs Urbšys and demanded in the form of an ultimatum that Lithuania cede the Klaipėda region of her own and transfer it to Germany. Note, he threatened that unless the demand was met, or if there was any delay, German troops would enter the region. When the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs arrived in Lithuania from Berlin, he informed the government of Germany's demand, adding that he had promised to give the Germans a quick reply. At the meeting of the Lithuanian government held on March 21, 1939, it was decided to cede the Klaipėda region to Germany. Urbšys hurriedly went to Berlin to sign the agreement on the transfer of the Klaipėda region to Germany. The loss of the Klaipėda territory was a blow not just to Lithuania's sovereignty, but to the working people who bore the consequences of decisions made behind closed doors. The port of Klaipėda was one of Lithuania's main arteries of trade. It was a vital lifeline for both imports and exports. With its seizure, Lithuania was economically strangled, and the burden fell hardest on the workers. Thousands of dock workers, sailors, and auxiliary laborers suddenly found themselves without work. Small local industries tied to maritime trade began to collapse or downsize. Whole communities, once tied to the economic pulse of the port, saw their livelihoods disintegrate overnight. For the peasantry inland, the loss meant rising costs of goods and fewer markets to send their produce, deepening the divide between the city and the countryside, between those who could afford to wait out the storm and those who could not. This betrayal of the people stirred unrest. The shock of losing Klaipėda radicalized workers. Anti-fascist sentiment grew, especially among workers who saw firsthand what German occupation meant. In the weeks and months following the annexation, the country was swept by strikes, protests, and political agitation, often violently repressed by the authorities. The anger wasn't only at Germany, it was also directed at the Lithuanian government, which had proven itself incapable of defending the people's interests and far too eager to pacify foreign powers. The political crisis deepened. Confidence in the bourgeois government eroded, and discussions among workers and youth increasingly turned toward socialist alternatives. This disillusionment with the status quo planted seeds that would grow in the coming years, especially as war approached and contradictions sharpened.
Šiandien susirinkome į istorinį suvažiavimą, į 5 Lietuvos Komunistų partijos bolševikų suvažiavimą. Pirmą legalų suvažiavimą po daugelio palėpės darbo metų. 20 su viršų metų mūsų partija žiauriojo buržuazijos teroro persekiojama ir kankinama, vadovavo didvyriškai liaudies kovai dėl savo išsilaisvinimo iš kapitalistų ir dvarininkų jungų.
The summer of 1940 marked a historic turning point for Lithuania. It was the breaking point forged over years of mounting pressure. For the working people, peasants, laborers, and the growing unemployed, the situation had become unbearable. Slums were multiplying on the outskirts of towns. Industry was being sold off to foreign monopolies, and wages were stagnating as profits left the country. Political arrests had become routine. Dissent was criminalized. Riots and strikes broke out with increasing frequency. If it wasn't already clear, the people were done with the Smetona dictatorship. That pressure finally boiled over in June of 1940. On June 15th, after months of unrest and failed repression, the revolutionary energy of the Lithuanian people exploded into action. Years of class struggle, strike activity, underground organizing, and political resistance culminated in a popular revolution. The old guard of Smetona loyalists found themselves facing not just anti-fascist militants and trade unionists, but broad public support for systemic change. On the other side stood anti-Smetona Republicans, leftists, and workers who were unified by their shared hatred of dictatorship and led, at least temporarily, by Antanas Smetona, a member of the Smetona regime who had broken with Smetona under immense public pressure. But the new government under Smetona didn't last long. While he attempted to maintain control, his political support collapsed almost overnight. The revolutionary momentum was too strong. Just days after the upheaval began, the Soviet Union responded, sending aid. Contrary to later anti-communist propaganda, the Red Army was not met with resistance, but with solidarity and open arms. Soviet troops entered a country that was already in the midst of revolutionary transformation, not to invade, but to prevent civil war and deter Nazi Germany from exploiting the internal instability. As Smetona failed to satisfy the demands of the working class, the People's Seimas intervened. On June 18th, he was asked to step down in favor of someone who genuinely represented the people, Justas Paleckis, a longtime communist, born into a working-class family, and a committed anti-fascist journalist. Paleckis had been part of the revolutionary left since the 1920s, and unlike the political elites, he didn't seek to defend the old system. He sought to bury it. And as for Antanas Smetona, the so-called strongman of independent Lithuania, when revolution finally arrived, he did not fight. He fled, bewildered that the nation he bled had the nerve to say, "No more." On June 15th, he left the country under the excuse of a vacation abroad. In reality, his regime had disintegrated, and he escaped to Germany and then the US before he could be arrested by the new government. He would live out the rest of his days in exile, a dictator exiled by his own people. Before we move on, it is necessary to address a crucial point of the Soviet involvement in these events, as that's something that can't be ignored. The relationship between the Baltic states and the USSR was defined, at least formally, by the Mutual Assistance Pact, under which the Soviet Union was permitted to station troops in the region if circumstances pointed to an imminent threat of war. This pact did not represent an occupation excuse. Rather, it reflected a planned measure aimed at preempting fascist aggression. The danger posed by Nazi Germany was neither hypothetical nor out of the question. As seen with Poland and Czechoslovakia, Germany had already shown how internal instability could be swiftly exploited by Hitler's regime to justify military intervention under the pretext of restoring order. In Lithuania's case, had the Soviet Union not acted, any outbreak of civil war would likely have served as a pretext for German intervention, bringing with it the systematic repression of communists, the dismantling of social movements, and the erasure of Lithuanian political agency under a fascist framework. Consequently, the arrival of Soviet forces must be understood not as an imposition of foreign rule, but as a means of averting a far more destructive alternative. The withdrawal of Smetona and the collapse of the previous regime marked the beginning of a transitional moment, one that opened the space for the Lithuanian people to initiate structural changes aligned with their class interests. With this in mind, we now turn to the documents of the period. Pamphlets, articles, speeches, and media reports, not just to see the official narratives, but to understand how the Lithuanian working class itself interpreted and reacted to these revolutionary developments as they occurred. This is an excerpt from a broadcast appeal made by Antanas Smetona, then acting president of the Republic of Lithuania, on June 16, 1940, just one day after Soviet aid helped push back the Smetona regime. Start quote, "Dear Lithuanians and all the inhabitants of the Lithuanian Republic. The unusually rapid succession of international developments has not left our country out either. The radio and press keep informing you of the main events that our country has witnessed in recent days. While assessing the newly developed situation, we must bear in mind the matters of vital importance for the life of our nation, the necessary conditions of peace and creative work. We are convinced that the arrival of the Soviet army units in Lithuania is in the interests of the security of both Lithuania and the Soviet Union. Thus, these troops have come to us as friendly Allied troops. They were met by our army as such and treated as such. All the inhabitants of the country must view and appraise this matter only in this light, in terms of the Mutual Assistance Treaty. The increase in strength of the Allied forces in Lithuania is quite understandable. Our internal social, cultural, economic, and political affairs should not be affected by it in any way. The main thing that the government is concerned about is to observe law and order, to prevent any interruption in the work of state institutions, enterprises, and in the sector of the private economy. The national economy and creative work in Lithuania will not be disturbed if the government officials perform their duties diligently, as they have done up to now, and if the broad sections of the population comply with their directions. Hence, normal work in offices, enterprises, workshops, factories, farms, and homes is to be carried on quietly. This is the major requirement at the moment." End quote. As mentioned at this point in June 1940, Lithuania had reached a boiling point. Years of growing inequality, unemployment, police repression, and foreign corporate influence had left workers and peasants deeply disillusioned. Riots and protests erupted across the country, culminating in a collective push, not just against the dictatorship of Smetona, but against the social order it represented. In the broadcast, we can see that Smetona is not resisting change. He is trying to manage it. His message is one of reassurance, aimed at calming a country in collapse. He frames the arrival of Soviet troops as cooperative and peaceful, which, in this context, it largely was. They came not as conquerors, but as supporters of a revolution already unfolding from within, one that had widespread popular support. His use of terms such as friendly Allied troops and normal work might sound sanitized today, but they reflect an attempt to preserve continuity during a radical shift. Smetona is urging the population to stay grounded while a new political reality takes shape. The order did not constitute a call to suppress revolution. Instead, it was a call to prevent chaos during a fragile transition. This is often where anti-socialist historians get it wrong. They portray this moment as the beginning of a Soviet takeover, as they ignore the fact that the Smetona regime had already collapsed, that workers and peasants had risen, and that many in Lithuania saw the shift not as an invasion, but as a chance for renewal. This is a speech by the Minister of Defense and Commander of the Army, General Vitkauskas, during the presentation of the Army and the Šiauliai Association High Commands to the President of the Republic, Palekis, June 20th, 1940. Start quote, "Mr. President of the Republic, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, higher commanders of the Army and chiefs of the Šiauliai Association have gathered here, Mr. President of the Republic, to offer you in the name of all the soldiers and Šiauliai their sincere congratulations, to wish you success in your highly responsible and important work, and to assure you that all the soldiers and Šiauliai shall do their duty in keeping with discipline and honesty, devoting all their energy to strengthen the security of their motherland. There has long been a feeling in the Army that the management of our state affairs occasionally took inappropriate forms. On our part, there have been attempts within the limits of military discipline to help in settling some of these affairs, but they have not always succeeded. The errors of the past enhance our determination to serve and defend our motherland in the new circumstances. We highly appreciate the might of the Red Army, which, on the basis of the treaty between the USSR and Lithuania of October 10, 1939, is to help Lithuania protect her freedom and independence. On this occasion, I have the honor to note, Mr. President of the Republic, that the relations between our Army and the Soviet Army and its command have been and remain amiable and friendly. We shall do our utmost to make these relations as friendly, sincere, full of mutual confidence and respect in the future, because we are convinced that it will be for the benefit of the common security of the USSR and Lithuania." End quote. As we can see by June 20th, the Smetona dictatorship had collapsed. The revolutionary momentum of June 15th had already shifted the power balance, and Paleckis had stepped in as a transitional president, as Merkys had stepped down and given him full presidential power. In his speech, Vitkauskas is addressing the military directly, aligning Lithuania's armed forces, which were historically an arm of state repression under Smetona, with a new revolutionary direction. He reassures them that discipline and duty still matter, but under new leadership with new goals. Most importantly, Vitkauskas openly praises the might of the Red Army and frames its presence in Lithuania as protective, not aggressive. He ties the alliance to a legal treaty of October 10, 1939, and frames it as a safeguard of Lithuania's true independence, not a threat to it. We can see just from the tone he uses that by the 20th, the situation had dived down significantly since last week. I want to touch a bit more quickly on Justas Paleckis, an important transitional leader after Merkys. Born in 1899 in the town of Telšiai to the family of a blacksmith, Paleckis was part of the Lithuanian oppressed and exploited class. His political development was shaped by the harsh inequalities of the capitalist order and the brutal repression of the interwar Lithuanian state. Initially active in the Lithuanian Popular Peasants' Union from 1926, Paleckis soon recognized the limits of moderate reform under bourgeois democracy. By 1930, he had joined the illegal Lithuanian Communist Party, which was operating underground, risking imprisonment to fight for the liberation of workers and peasants. Throughout the 1930s, he served as editor of an underground left-wing newspaper, where he exposed the crimes of the Smetona regime and gave voice to those silenced by state repression. Paleckis was among the most principled and consistent critics of the Lithuanian bourgeoisie, condemning their collaboration with foreign fascism and their ruthless exploitation of the masses. When the revolution of 1940 came to a head, it was increasingly clear that the existing government under Antanas Merkys had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Merkys, a representative of the old elite, could no longer contain the growing revolutionary demands of workers, peasants, and progressive forces. On June 18, 1940, following the resignation of Merkys under popular and political pressure, the Lithuanian Seimas entrusted Justas Paleckis with forming a new government, one that would reflect the will of the people. Paleckis accepted this responsibility as a transitional leader tasked with steering the country toward a new socialist future. In these critical weeks, he oversaw the peaceful transfer of power to a people's government and laid the groundwork for Lithuania's entry into the family of socialist republics. Paleckis served as acting head of state from June 18th to August 9th, 1940, when he voluntarily stepped down to allow Antanas Sniečkus, the highly respected chairman of the Lithuanian Communist Party's Central Committee, to assume leadership. His role, though brief, was decisive in ensuring that the revolutionary momentum of the Lithuanian people was not diverted or suppressed. Justas Paleckis was not a career politician or opportunist. He was a committed revolutionary, a man of the people, and a bridge between decades of underground struggle and the dawn of socialism in Lithuania. He would continue to be a big part of the Lithuanian Communist Party and the Lithuanian SSR up until 1967, when he retired. On June 18, 1940, a declaration of the People's Government was published. It said, quote, "The People's Government had emerged upon the fall of the arbitrary regime, born of violence, and that the formation of the new government opened the way for fresh social forces to join in raising the nation's welfare and promoting cultural progress." End quote. The government quickly set itself the task to transform the country's political system, to set free jailed communists, to dissolve the Seimas of the nationalists, to abolish electoral qualifications introduced by them for the elections to self-government bodies, to implement equality of nationalities, and to introduce broad reforms in the fields of health protection and education. As for foreign policy, the government intended to maintain normal relations with all states. The relations between Lithuania and the USSR were given special consideration. The declaration pointed out that the new government was a government of those sections of the population who lived by their work, and that it was not going to change the initiative of the popular masses seeking to transform the political system of the country. It emphasized that from then the role of the working class and all the working people in the life of the state was to increase. In its appeal of June 18th, the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party greeted the People's Government, headed by Justas Paleckis, expressed its confidence in it, and called on the working people to give it their support. The People's Government carried out the changes in the political and economic life of the country by constitutional means in strict conformity with the laws that were valid before its formation. The previous structure of the state apparatus was left intact. Only the content of its activities was changed. The laws and the state apparatus were subjected to serve the interests of the people. Based on relevant sections of the Constitution and the acts of the President of the Republic, urgent steps were being taken to reorganize the Secret Service and the police, tools of suppression in the hands of the former regime. Reactionary officials who had defended the interests of the exploiter classes and committed acts of violence against the working people were removed from key positions in the state apparatus. On June 18th, 104 communist leaders were released from the Kaunas convict prison, among them Antanas Smetona, first secretary of the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party. On June 19th to 21st alone, over 400 revolutionary political prisoners were released from jails in Sauliai, Panevėžys, Marijampolė, Ukmergė, Vilnius, and Raseiniai, as well as from the Dimitrovas and Pabraidė concentration camps. Released from the jails, the anti-fascist political prisoners were given appointments in the central government apparatus or were sent to work in the state bodies, in the places where they had participated in underground activities. The press was giving a big coverage of the reorganization of the state apparatus, appointments of new ministers, deputy ministers, heads of departments, and other officials, dwelling upon their progressive anti-fascist activities and the services to the working people. These actions of the People's Government stirred up political activity among the working people. Inspired by revolutionary enthusiasm and seeing that the people's government was acting in their interests, the workers and peasants began demanding to immediately rearrange the life in the country on new principles. Workers' and employees' committees began to spring up. Their purpose was to defend the interests of the working class and to enhance its role in the country's political and economic life. The committees were to regulate relations between workers and factory owners, to supervise the implementation of the government's directives by factories and enterprises, and to safeguard their factories. Workers and state control were introduced at major state enterprises and banks. On June 26, 1940, the People's Militia was established. It was set to guard state and public offices, industrial enterprises of particular importance, and so on. The recruiting of the militia was under the control of the working class, which, through the People's Militia, took over the preservation of public order. The activity of trade unions with mass organizations of the working class was expanded, and the scope of activities of trade union committees and their influence on the government bodies was enhanced. State control organs drew into their activities the representatives of plant and factory workers' committees and trade unions. In the countryside, the poor peasants began to set up peasant committees. These were entrusted with the task of looking after the economic interests of the small and middle peasants, including control over the activities of local self-government bodies. On the recommendations of the committees, the debts of peasants to the state were either reduced or written off altogether, and more favorable terms to obtain timber were provided, etc. All this enhanced the political activity of the peasants, strengthened their confidence in the government's actions. From July 3, 1940, the reorganization of the old Lithuanian army was undertaken. The law on the reorganization of the army was passed. The army was renamed the Lithuanian People's Army. So, the reactionaries and the bourgeoisie in general were deprived of the right to exercise social oppression, while the foundations of the new social order were being laid simultaneously.
Буржуaziniais laikais nemažai inteligentijos atstovų kėlė klausimą apie Nemuno vandens energijos panaudojimą krašto elektrifikavimui. Tačiau buržuazinis Lietuvos ekonominėme ir politinėme gyvenime šeimininkavo užsienio kapitalas. Lietuvos buržuazinė valdžia, paklusniai vykdydama užsienio monopolijų valią, nesiėmė jokių priemonių hidroelektrinės statybai prie Nemuno. Tik tarybų valdžios metais tapo galima įgyvendinti tokią milžinišką statybą, kokia yra Kauno hidroelektrinė.
On June 25, 1940, the People's Government, per Article 81 of the Constitution, decided to ask the President of the Republic to dissolve the reactionary Seimas and to call new elections. By the President's Act of June 27th, the Seimas was dissolved. The elections to the new Seimas were discussed at the government meeting on July 5th. It was decided to make a declaration to the people on the elections to the People's Seimas, to approve the electoral law, and to appoint the Central Electoral Committee. On July 6, 1940, these documents of the People's Government were made public and appeared in the press. The new electoral law granted all citizens of Lithuania who had reached the age of 21 the right to vote. One Seimas deputy was to be elected for every 35,000 people. It was made to elect 79 deputies. Lithuania was divided into 8 electoral districts. Soon afterwards, an electoral bloc called the Working People's Union of Lithuania emerged. On July 6th, it made public its platform, containing the electoral demands of workers, peasants, intelligentsia, and other sections of the people. During the election campaign, the former regime came under extensive criticism, with agitation for a socialist Lithuania being carried on. The mass media, the activists of the Communist Party, the Young Communist League, the the trade unions, the People's Aid Union, and all other organizations functioning then joined the campaign. Candidates to the People's Seimas were nominated at the meetings of the working people by majority vote. The nominated and registered candidates were discussed by collective bodies of the working people, who then gave their mandates to the would-be Seimas deputies. The representatives of the bourgeoisie were not banned from taking part in the meetings of the working people and from nominating their candidates. The working people, however, did not put forward such candidates to the People's Seimas. In general, the bourgeoisie came to the elections in full disarray. During the election campaign, a nationwide movement for friendship and rapprochement with the Soviet Union was gaining strength. As early as June 18th, the People's Government stressed that its first and foremost task was to maintain sincere and friendly relations with the Soviet Union. The electoral platform of the Working People's Union of Lithuania also said that all Lithuania's citizens and patriots, all the electors, irrespective of their social status, nationality, or religion, were called to vote for the candidates who were resolved and able to fight consistently for friendship and alliance between the Republic of Lithuania and the Soviet Union. The election manifesto of the Working People's Union of Lithuania, addressed to the workers, peasants, soldiers, and all other working-class peoples, published in all the newspapers that the organ of the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party said that, quote, inviolable and closest possible friendship with the Soviet peoples and a firm alliance with the great Soviet Union make and are to make in future the main guiding principle of the policy pursued by Labour Lithuania. It is only on this friendship and close relationship that the future of our native land depends." End quote. The editorial, carried on the eve of the elections by the newspaper Darbininkij Žodis, clarified the attitude of the working people towards the current political trend in Lithuania. It pointed out that the quote, "The working man who has come out from the basements and huts shall not stop halfway." Manifestations, demonstrations, and meetings show that the working people are resolved to follow the way indicated to the proletariat by Marx and Lenin, the way chosen by the USSR. End quote. The election campaign ended on July 13th. On July 14th to 15th, 1,386,569 electors, which was 95.51% of all who had the right to vote, a mind-blowing voter turnout showing just how much people wanted change. Of these, 1,375,349, that being 99.19%, voted for the candidates of the Working People's Union of Lithuania. 79 deputies were elected to the People's Seimas, 22 workers, 25 peasants, 28 intellectuals, 1 artisan, and 3 soldiers. 49 deputies of the Seimas were the once released from prison not too long ago, making up 62.2% of all its members, including the head secretary of the Lithuanian Communist Party, Antanas Sniečkus. The first session of the People's Seimas was held in Kaunas on July 21, 1940. It was opened by Justas Palekis, acting president of the Republic. In his speech, he dwelt upon the history of the struggle of the working people for communist power in Lithuania and on the work accomplished by the people's government. The Seimas approved of the government's activities, expressed its confidence in it, and authorized the government to continue in office. Lithuania's state system was the pivotal question on the agenda of the People's Seimas. In considering the question, the Seimas considered the long struggle of Lithuania's working people for the socialist system, their will to create a Lithuania in which state power would belong to the people themselves, without capitalists and exploiters. After discussing the question of the state system, on July 21st, the People's Seimas unanimously adopted the Declaration on the State System. It proclaimed the introduction of the Soviet system in Lithuania and stated that all power in the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic henceforth was vested in the working people of town and country, in Soviets elected by them. Therefore, the People's Seimas enacted the establishment of Soviet power in Lithuania, not by an evil invasion, but by democracy and immense support for it. During this time, preparations were underway in the West for an aggression against the USSR. Large German forces were massed on the Soviet-German border. With the capitulation of France, the Nazis increased the number of their armed forces in the borderland. 36 divisions were moved there between mid-June and September in 1940. The concentration of German armed forces against the Soviet Union represented a threat to Soviet Lithuania too. In their aggressive designs against the Soviet Union, the Nazis intended to seize Lithuania first. The threat on the part of Hitler's Germany impelled Soviet Lithuania to lean on the powerful Soviet state for support, to unite its forces with those of the Soviet Union to safeguard the achievements of the working people. There were other considerations too, which conditioned the necessity of joining the USSR. Therefore, the People's Seimas enacted the establishment of Soviet power in Lithuania, not by an evil invasion, but by democracy and immense support for it. During this time, preparations were underway in the West for an aggression against the USSR. Large German forces were massed on the Soviet-German border. With the capitulation of France, the Nazis increased the number of their armed forces in the borderland. 36 divisions were moved there between mid-June and September in 1940. The concentration of German armed forces against the Soviet Union represented a threat to Soviet Lithuania too. In their aggressive designs against the Soviet Union, the Nazis intended to seize Lithuania first. The threat on the part of Hitler's Germany impelled Soviet Lithuania to lean on the powerful Soviet state for support, to unite its forces with those of the Soviet Union to safeguard the achievements of the working people. There were other considerations too, which conditioned the necessity of joining the USSR. In the first place, it was necessary to create the most favorable economic conditions for the construction of socialism in Lithuania. The experience of the Soviet Union had proved that the tasks of socialist construction could be accomplished only by joint effort, by mutual assistance among peoples. Taking all this into account, the People's Seimas discussed the question of Lithuania's entrance into the USSR and unanimously adopted the Declaration on Lithuania's entrance into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The declaration stressed that without the states' union of the Soviet republics, without gathering their forces, it would be impossible to oppose the united forces of capitalists in either military or economic fields. On July 22nd, the People's Seimas discussed the nationalization of land. The Seimas declared the land to be the property of the state. The declaration on the land question pointed out that the landless and poor peasants would be given land free of charge from the state land fund, made up of the land obtained by cutting down the estates and large farms. The Seimas freed the peasants from the installment payments left from the times of the bourgeois land reform. In addition, the peasants were freed of arrears and fines imposed on them by administrative bodies of the former regime. On July 23rd, the Seimas adopted a decision on the nationalization of large-scale industry. The nationalization of banks, large-scale industry, transport, and trade aimed at putting an end to the influence of the bourgeoisie in Lithuania's economy and at concentrating the country's economic life in the hands of communist power. The adoption of these declarations by the People's Seimas laid the economic foundations for the building of socialism in Lithuania. This was also one of the prerequisites for Lithuania's entrance into the USSR. In conclusion, the People's Seimas elected an authorized mission which was entrusted to deliver to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR the declaration on the entrance of Soviet Lithuania into the Soviet Union. On August 3, 1940, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, at its 7th session, discussed the question of Soviet Lithuania's admission into the USSR. It decided to fulfill the request of the People's Seimas and to accept the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic into the USSR as a Union Republic. The great achievements made by Soviet Lithuania as a constituent Soviet republic in the fields of economic, cultural, and social development under socialism have substantiated the historic self-determination made in the summer of 1940.
Šiandien mūsų laukia nauji dideli uždaviniai toliau statant komunizmą. Mes esame tikri, kad šiuos uždavinius sėkmingai įvykdysime. Ateitis priklauso komunizmui.
This is the declaration of the People's Seimas proclaiming Lithuania, a Soviet Socialist Republic, adopted on July 21, 1940. Quote, "The regime of Smetona, indifferent to the real interests of the people, pushed the Lithuanian internal and external policy into a hopeless impasse. The vital interests of the Lithuanian working people were sacrificed to the selfish interests of small groups of wealthy people and exploiters. The destiny of the toiling people in cities and villages was unemployment, uncertainty for the future, privation, and ethnic group inequality. For many years, the people were oppressed by this reactionary regime. The Lithuanian people could no longer tolerate such arbitrariness and treachery in their relations with foreign governments. The people liquidated the hated government, along with the high administration, and thus cleared the way for the free elections of the People's Seimas, which could truly represent the interests of the working people, and was constructed by the people's own hands. The days of July 14th to 15th were historic in the life of the toiling people of Lithuania. In these days, the alliance of workers, peasants, and working intelligentsia. These days marked the victory of the platform of the Union of the Working People of Lithuania. This platform rallied all honest patriots of the country and all who cherished Lithuania's interests. In these days, the Lithuanian people expressed their will to abolish the political domination of landlords and capitalists forever, and also to form a real people's government, and, with its own hand, to begin the reorganization of the governmental structure of our country. The victory of the Union of the Working People of Lithuania is a historic turning point, granting the working people all civic and political rights, guaranteeing a better future for them and future generations. The People's Seimas, as representative of the sovereign will of Lithuania, being called upon to strengthen its victories achieved in the struggle with plutocrats, considers its main task and duty to resolve the question of the form of the Lithuanian regime on a new basis. From the great historic experience of the peoples of the USSR, we have learned that only the Soviet power is a real representative and defender of the interests of the working people, that only the Soviet government is a real people-esque government, where the country is governed by the people themselves without capitalists and landlords. Only the Soviets represent a real incarnation of the alliance between workers and peasants. The People's Seimas, expressing the unanimous will of the working people, proclaims that the Soviet system shall be introduced in Lithuania. Lithuania shall be proclaimed a Soviet Socialist Republic. Beginning today, all power in the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic shall belong to the working people of the cities and villages, represented in the Soviets by their own representatives. The People's Seimas is firmly convinced that all inhabitants of Lithuania will rally around the Soviet government to assure welfare, economic and cultural prosperity, to give our country freedom and happiness, and to lead the country towards the final victory of the people. Long live the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Long live the Soviets of the working people's deputies." End quote. As we see, By July 21st, the political transformation of Lithuania had reached its peak, and a few conclusions. The People's Seimas, elected just days earlier in the most democratic vote in Lithuanian history to that point, now spoke directly on behalf of the working class, the peasants, and the progressives of the country. The declaration marked a final break with the Smetona-era bourgeois regime and firmly positioned Lithuania on a new socialist path, aligning itself with the global movement of working people. We can see that in the declaration, the Seimas is no stranger to criticizing the previous regime. It identifies Smetona's government as an obstacle to progress, indifferent to the real needs of the people, and ultimately subservient to the interests of exploiters and landlords. The people had suffered enough under this narrow elite. Rural poverty, urban unemployment, and deep ethnic inequality had become normalized features of life in interwar Lithuania. The collapse of the Smetona regime was a rejection of a social order built on privilege and repression. The People's Seimas acknowledges this rupture and celebrates it as a revolutionary turning point. They affirm that the hated government had been liquidated, not just overthrown. Crucially, the Seimas positions itself not as a continuation of any old order, but as the product of a revolution. It emphasizes that this was a body constructed by the people's own hands, a claim that speaks to both its legitimacy and its historic role. It had emerged from the July 14th to 15th elections, which had seen mass mobilization behind the union of the working people of Lithuania, which we know was the mobilization of a broad popular front that united all genuine patriots committed to national and social liberation. The Seimas then moves from critique to construction. While yes, they critique the old regime, they also understand what's to come. It affirms that only the Soviet form of government has proven capable of representing the working people, and that only Soviet councils of workers' deputies can express true democracy. Importantly, it draws a line between bourgeois parliamentary forms and the direct power of the Soviets. For the Seimas, the Soviet model is not a foreign imposition, but a historical necessity, rooted in experience and class logic. From that logic flows the ultimate decision to the proclamation of Lithuania as a Soviet Socialist Republic. The declaration places all power in the hands of the working people, explicitly those of both city and countryside, who will now rule through their Soviets. It affirms that this transformation is not just political, but economic and cultural. The Soviet Republic will guarantee welfare, prosperity, and genuine civic freedom for future generations. Finally, the declaration ends with a rallying cry. It calls on all Lithuanians to unite around the Soviet government, to build socialism together, and to carry forward the legacy of the June Revolution. This is an extract from the declaration adopted by the People's Seimas on Lithuania's addition request to the USSR, July 22, 1940, quote, "The existing Soviet Socialist republics are not closed and separated one from another, but they constitute an indestructible union. They entered the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on an equal, free basis. From experience, we have learned that collaboration between the Soviet republics gave them exceptional prosperity, huge economic and cultural development. In a short time, they became the most progressive republics from a political, economic, and cultural point of view. Never would an individual republic achieve such results. From experience, we have learned that only united Soviet republics could oppose imperialistic efforts to enslave small people. Without a states' union of the Soviet republics, without gathering together their economic and military forces into a union, it would be impossible to oppose the united forces of capitalists in either economic or military fields. The Lithuanian people know that the policy of the Soviet Union toward Lithuania was friendly at all times. If Lithuania was not seized by the landlords of Poland, if the old Lithuanian capital Vilnius was returned to Lithuania, if Lithuania could stay away from World War fire, if the Lithuanian people could establish in their country the only just system of government, Soviet system, it is all due to the Soviet Union. Therefore, the Lithuanian people in all times have seen a better future in closer relationship with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The reactionary criminal clique of former Lithuanian rulers obstructed by every means the fraternal relationship between Lithuania and the USSR, trying to prevent the conclusion of a firm and inviolable union between the USSR and Lithuania. Now, the Lithuanian people, freed from violence and lawlessness, and having established a new state and social order, shall ratify by law a firm friendship and union between the Lithuanian Republic and the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. The Lithuanian people's Seimas is convinced that only entrance in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics will guarantee the true sovereignty of the Lithuanian state, the real development of industry and economy, the real blossom of national culture, and the complete development of material and spiritual forces of the people. Obedient to the will of the people, who overthrew the old regime of oppression and lawlessness, the regime of exploitation of man, the people's Seimas resolved to ask the Supreme Soviet of the USSR to admit the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic in the body of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Republics as a union republic on the same basis as the Ukrainian, the Belarusian, and other union republics. Long live the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Long live the great union of the Soviet Socialist Republics." End quote. With the people's Seimas now fully in control and the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic proclaimed, the next logical step was the formal integration into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. We can see this wasn't framed as an annexation or external imposition. It was presented and understood by many as a culmination of years of class struggle, geopolitical isolation, and a historic opportunity to align with a truly socialist federation. In the declaration, the Seimas begins by describing the nature of the Soviet Union as an equal union of republics, referring to it as an indestructible union, built from below by the will of workers and peasants. The rhetoric here directly counters bourgeois narratives of Soviet centralism. Instead, the USSR is depicted as a collective shield, a common front of small and large peoples working together for mutual development and defense. From the Seimas' perspective, they saw how the Soviet republics had undergone rapid industrialization, literacy campaigns, cultural revival, and social development unparalleled in capitalist countries, especially during the economic crisis of the 1930s. The declaration emphasizes that no small republic could have achieved these gains alone, that only a union of socialist states, unified in purpose and structure, could defend itself against imperialist threats, both military and economic. They make it no secret of the aid given to the Lithuanian people by the USSR even before the revolution. A few things we discussed earlier in this video, such as blocking Polish landlords' control over Lithuania during the interwar period, restoring Vilnius to Lithuania in 1939, keeping Lithuania out of the initial fires of World War II, shielding it from the devastation that engulfed much of Europe, and, of course, aiding in its overthrow of the old regime without war. The declaration openly states that Lithuania's opportunity to build socialism was made possible by the USSR. This is a crucial ideological point, that Soviet power didn't suppress Lithuanian sovereignty, but created the conditions for its genuine realization by freeing it from capitalist dependency, foreign monopolies, and internal reaction. From here, the text turns its attention to the class enemy, that being the reactionary criminal clique, of former Lithuanian rulers. The People's Seimas accuses them of sabotaging relations with the USSR, not out of patriotism, but in the service of their own elite interests. Their obstruction of deeper union is framed as betrayal. Having now overthrown this exploitative class, the new socialist order asserts itself as capable of ratifying a true friendship between nations based on equality and solidarity. The Seimas doesn't present union with the USSR as surrender. They show a deliberate, lawful step, grounded in popular will, revolutionary legitimacy, and internationalist values. It's worth noting the formulation used at the end of the declaration that Lithuania would join the USSR on the same basis as Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics. This emphasizes equality within the Union. It situates Lithuania as a co-equal builder of socialism alongside other national republics. The Lithuanian people, now free from landlordism and capitalist exploitation, choose their place in the family of socialist nations. Their future, industrial, cultural, and spiritual, would no longer be in the hands of exploiters, but in the collective hands of the Soviet peoples. This will be our last speech extract for the video, so I thought it would be fitting to get one from one of my most favorite political Lithuanian figures, revolutionary hero Antanas Sniečkus, and head of the committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party. Speech. Sniečkus delivered on behalf of the Credentials Committee, July 22, 1940, quote, "Comrades deputies of the People's Seimas, citizens of Socialist Soviet Lithuania, July 21st and July 22nd. These dates shall never be blotted out of the memory of our nation. They mark the most significant turn in all our long and glorious history. The turn from slavery and lawlessness to freedom, well-being, and happiness. Today and yesterday, the Seimas adopted decisions of historic importance. Expressing the will of the people, the Seimas has decided that henceforth, Lithuania shall be a Soviet Socialist Republic. By adopting the declaration on Lithuania's entrance into the USSR and requesting the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union to admit Lithuania into the USSR as a Union Republic, the Seimas has enacted an old desire of our people. However, the Seimas did not confine itself to establishing the state system. At the same time, it has created the material base of Soviet Socialist Lithuania by solving the land question in favor of the working people. Thereby, an end has been put to the domination of big landowners and exploiters. The historic decisions of the Seimas were prepared by the entire previous struggle of the Lithuanian people, their features being outlined during the election campaign. The bourgeois regime had oppressed, despised, and deceived the working people of Lithuania for 22 years. Hardly had it fallen, hardly had our people relished the coming of a new epoch, which brought them freedom from oppression and neglect, allowed them to speak out boldly about their sore subjects, when the activity of the masses in Lithuania stirred up unusually. This activity was especially impressive during the election campaign to the People's Seimas, at hundreds of meetings of workers, peasants, servicemen, and working intelligentsia throughout Lithuania. It would be perhaps superfluous to speak in detail about the feelings of the Lithuanian masses, for there is hardly a single person here who did not witness himself and did not share the unprecedented enthusiasm permeating the election campaign to this first genuine People's Seimas of utmost importance for the country. Unfortunately, during the first polling day, the weather was bad almost all over Lithuania. It was raining nearly all day. Roads in many places became waterlogged, and in lower places were hardly passable. Yet, in spite of this, the people went on foot and horse to cast their votes for the candidates of the Working People's Union of Lithuania. For every voter realized that for the first time in the history of our country, he was going to elect people of his own. representatives of the working people, into whose hands he could safely put all his wishes and desires, all his hopes for a better life. As we know, in such a contingency, which might have prevented the working people from expressing their will, the elections were prolonged by the President of the Republic by one more day. It turned out, however, that an overwhelming number of voters went to the polls on the first day. Still, many of those who, during the first day, could not go to the polls because of advanced age, state of health, or for some other reason, made use of their vote on the second day. The People's Seimas was elected by the entire working people of Lithuania without resorting to any measures of compulsion or reprisals, for the people realized perfectly the enormous importance this Seimas had for the fate of toiling Lithuania." End quote. Antanas Sniečkus, longtime underground communist, resistance organizer, and head of the Lithuanian Communist Party, stepped forward to speak directly to the newly elected People's Seimas. He states that the revolution was not just a change in who held power, but a rupture in the historical trajectory of Lithuania itself. In his opening lines, Sniečkus frames July 21st and 22nd as foundational dates. He has a passionate tone when talking about these events. He draws a sharp line between the past and the present as he states the old order was slavery and lawlessness, while the new era is one of freedom, well-being, and happiness. For Sniečkus, these days don't just mark legal reforms. They signify the end of bourgeois national history and the beginning of socialist Lithuanian history. He reaffirms that what had just occurred in the Seimas, as the organ of working-class power, had not only declared the Lithuanian SSR, but had also formally requested entrance into the USSR. But then Sniečkus emphasizes a second, equally vital decision of land reform. He describes this as the material foundation of Soviet power in Lithuania, the abolition of the big landowners' estates and the redistribution of land to working people. He also makes it clear that these historic decisions were not made behind closed doors or imposed from above. He states they were the product of long-standing mass struggle. He roots the moment in a broader revolutionary continuum of 22 years of capitalist repression that had generated class hatred, and now that pent-up energy had exploded. He focuses in particular on the election campaign that brought the People's Seimas into being. Here, Sniečkus brings up what might seem like a routine moment of the election into a mass revolutionary event. People were organized, they debated, they mobilized. Workers, peasants, soldiers, and teachers held hundreds of meetings across the country, pushing for the program of the Working People's Union. He even mentions the bad weather during the first polling day. He notes his surprise that, despite rain, flooded roads, and harsh conditions, people still traveled by foot and horse to cast their votes. Sniečkus closes by reinforcing the legitimacy of the People's Seimas itself. He asserts that it was chosen by the entire working people of Lithuania, and that it holds the confidence of the masses. Before we end the video, I want to teach you a bit more about Antanas Smetona, a figure that I have brought up quite a few times in this video. Sniečkus was a steadfast revolutionary who, from his youth, devoted himself to the cause of the working class and the liberation of his homeland from both foreign domination and domestic bourgeois tyranny. Born on January 10, 1903, in a peasant family in the Telšiai County, Sniečkus grew up witnessing firsthand the contradictions of rural life under capitalism. Though his family was relatively well off by peasant standards, his father's early death in 1914 left a lasting impact. During World War I, Sniečkus was displaced to Voronezh, where he continued his education among the children of war refugees. It was there that his political consciousness began to sharpen. By 1917, even before the October Revolution, The young Sniečkus was already a sympathizer of Bolshevism, influenced by underground Marxist circles and youth organizations advocating socialist transformation. Returning to Lithuania in 1918, at only 15 years old, which was still under German occupation, he did not retreat to a quiet life. Instead, he pursued technical training, all while deepening his commitment to the revolutionary cause. In 1920, at just 17 years old, he formally joined the Communist Party of Lithuania, an act that defined the rest of his life. He threw himself into party work, distributing literature, organizing cells, and building networks in the underground. Repression was immediate. In 1921, he was arrested and imprisoned for his activism. When the threat of a military court loomed, the party smuggled him to Soviet Russia, where he studied at Smolensk State University and later the Plekhanov Institute of Economics in Moscow. But Sniečkus did not retreat to academia. He remained active in the Lithuanian section of the Comintern, helping publish and distribute illegal revolutionary materials destined for the workers of Lithuania. Following the coup of 1926, which overthrew the elected left-wing government and installed the Smetona dictatorship, Sniečkus returned to Lithuania at great personal risk. Many of his comrades had been arrested, tortured, or shot. He quickly rose to leadership, eventually becoming a member of the Communist Party Central Committee at 23 years old. He worked tirelessly in the underground against fascism, capital, and imperialism during this time. In 1930, he was again arrested, this time sentenced to 15 years by a military court. He endured 3 brutal years in prison before being freed in a prisoner exchange. Even in exile, he remained at the heart of the international communist movement, representing Lithuania in the executive committee of the Comintern, training cadres, and participating in high-level strategy. Undeterred, Sniečkus re-entered Lithuania in 1936 to continue the underground struggle. Despite constant surveillance and danger, he became the first secretary of the Lithuanian Communist Party, leading resistance against the reactionary regime. In 1939, he was arrested yet again and sentenced to 8 years in prison, a sentence he would not complete. In June 1940, with the collapse of the Smetona regime and the rising revolutionary tide, Sniečkus was freed as the people reclaimed their country. After his release, he was appointed director of the State Security Department, helping secure the revolution from sabotage and counter-revolution. In August 1940, he was formally elected first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Lithuania, an appointment later affirmed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Sniečkus' life is the story of unwavering commitment, from youthful agitation to underground leadership, from the Comintern halls in Moscow to the prison cells of the Smetona dictatorship. At every stage, he stood as a vanguard of the proletariat, guiding Lithuania on its path to socialism with clarity, courage, and unshakable Marxist conviction. This is an extract from the appeal of the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party, written to the working people, issued to mark the introduction of the Soviet socialist system in Lithuania, July 24, 1940. Quote, "Comrades, workers, peasants, servicemen, and all other working people. The time has come when we are really free, when the dream cherished by our people for many a long year has come true. The Soviet socialist system has been introduced in our country. We have proclaimed a Soviet Socialist Republic. We would bear in mind, however, the Seimas decisions alone will not bring us a socialist republic. These historic decisions have to be implemented. Socialist Lithuania must be built by us. Comrades, workers and peasants, servicemen, working intelligentsia, sons and daughters of Lithuania, let us join our efforts in the cause of socialist construction. Our enemies are on the alert, and with time passing, they will become ever more determined. Foreboding their end and seeing no escape, the enemies of the people, overt and in disguise, have been performing acts of sabotage, destroying and damaging the wealth of the country, which from now on belongs to the entire people. Do not allow the enemies of the people to inflict damage on our wealth. Let us rally immediately and keep ranks. Start setting up laborers and peasants' committees to protect the estates, now belonging to them, and to organize the working people in the countryside in general. Let us set up wherever they are still missing factory committees to guard enterprises from subversive activities on the part of former factory owners and their disguised accomplices. Let us strengthen and cultivate conscious discipline of labor and raise labor productivity, because from now on, we are working for ourselves. Let us establish a numerous and strong people's militia, an effective weapon against various enemies and saboteurs. Let us root out all those who would like to put on us the fetters of capitalism again. May the great enthusiasm shown in the squares and streets, in towns and villages, now be turned into creative enthusiasm, the one which would make our native country a beautiful and happy place to live in. Let every working man redouble his efforts in the construction of socialism. Our immediate task is to sweep away all the survivals of capitalist slavery and, with the help of the fraternal peoples of the USSR, to build as speedily as possible a happy and prosperous socialist Lithuania. Long live the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Long live the Lithuanian Communist Party, the leader of Lithuania's working people. Long live the friendly family of Soviet peoples." End quote. By July 24th, the revolutionary government had already made its major structural declarations. Lithuania was now a Soviet Socialist Republic, and a request for admission into the USSR had been formally sent. But declarations alone do not build socialism. That's the core message of this appeal from the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party. The party speaks directly to the people, workers, peasants, soldiers, intellectuals, and begins with a declaration of victory. The Soviet system had finally arrived, and with it, the dream of a free Lithuania, built not on exploitation, but on collective ownership and popular power. But what follows is equally important. A clear, sober reminder that the Seimas decisions are only the beginning. The real work must come now, through mass participation and organized class struggle. This appeal turns the political revolution into a social revolution. It makes clear that the enemy hasn't disappeared. Former capitalists, landlords, and their ideological allies, whether open or disguised, were still active, attempting sabotage and spreading fear. The party calls for vigilance and grassroots organization to meet these forces head-on. The document lays out a practical, bottom-up approach to defending and building socialism. It calls for laborers and peasants' committees to guard the newly socialized land and organize rural society, for factory committees to oversee enterprises and protect them from internal sabotage. It calls for the formation of a people's militia, a revolutionary force rooted in the masses themselves as a shield against the enemies of socialism. This represents the beginning of a new institutional order, one that displaces private ownership with collective management and shifts power from capitalists to workers at the point of production. Another central theme is conscious labor discipline and productivity. The appeal stresses that from now on, Lithuanians are not working for bosses or export profits. They are working for themselves, for their families, for their future. And importantly, The Communist Party does not pretend this process is isolated. It openly acknowledges the vital role of fraternal solidarity with the peoples of the USSR. The Lithuanian SSR would not be building socialism alone. It would do so with the guidance, support, and shared experience of the broader Soviet family. This is framed not as dependence, but as unity, mutual aid among equals on a shared socialist path. In tone, the appeal moves from rallying pride to practical urgency. It calls for creative enthusiasm, the same energy shown in revolutionary demonstrations and elections, now to be channeled into the construction of infrastructure, of schools, of cooperatives, and of culture. This is the moment when the revolution becomes real in daily life. They make it clear that the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic is to be not just a political entity, but a living, breathing project of transformation, powered by the working class, guided by the Communist Party, and sustained through unity with the entire Soviet world.
Коммунисты, трудящиеся Литвы, горячо одобряют и единодушно поддерживают деятельность Коммунистической партии Советского Союза и ее Ленинского Центрального комитета, направленную на дальнейшее развитие экономического потенциала страны и укрепление ее оборонной мощи, повышение материального и культурного уровня советского народа, сплочение сил социализма и демократии во всем мире. Коммунисты Литвы дали наказ нам, делегатам, выразить Ленинскому Центральному комитету КПСС за все это сердечную благодарность и передать наилучшие пожелания успешной работы 24-му партийному съезду.
As we've seen throughout this video, communism in Lithuania wasn't some foreign imposition. It was a long-awaited transformation, envisioned by the people even before the Smetona regime. We can see it embraced by the people with enthusiasm, clarity, and determination. For years, Lithuanians had suffered under the weight of capitalist inequality, landlord exploitation, and nationalist repression. But in the summer of 1940, for the first time in modern Lithuanian history, the working masses were given a real voice, and they used it to choose a different path. There was no brutal invasion, no tanks rolling through the streets to force ballots, no resistance fighters hiding in the forests, no mass uprisings against Soviet authority. What happened in July 1940 was something far more powerful, a political awakening. A people, tired, exploited, and silenced for decades, had seized the moment to build a new society based on workers' power, collective ownership, and international solidarity. The July elections to the People's Seimas were not rigged as nationalist historians would make you think. We can see this clearly in that, despite the rain, the mud, and the roadblocks, both literal and political, people came out in overwhelming numbers to vote for the Working People's Union. And the result was clear: over 99% support for the revolutionary platform and for joining the USSR. For the first time, Lithuanians could see a future without capitalists or landlords, without poverty or war. Lithuania's integration into the USSR was not the death of freedom. It was its beginning for the working class, for the peasantry, for the long-silenced majority. It was a revolution, not in the abstract, but in real, tangible change through land reform, factory control, cultural renewal, and sovereignty grounded in socialism, not in bourgeois nationalism. Thank you for watching, comrades. This video has been my biggest project I have ever worked on. Months of research and weeks of editing, but I have enjoyed it, and I hope I have taught you a lot about the history of my nation. I first started this project to discredit the lies told about socialist Lithuania. I never expected to learn so much about what I wasn't told. If you're interested in discussing history, theory, or organizing with other socialists and communists, feel free to join my Discord. The link is in the description. Alongside all the sources used in this video are also cited below for further reading and verification. Until next time, solidarity, and long live the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic.
Свою жизнь для тебя преврати в цветы.